I also wonder about people who, younger people who were only getting their information from these platforms. Are they aware of other news websites and other places to pull news from? Did they move or did they just stop getting
Good news, yeah.
this information, period?
Well, this is a really good question. And I think I've said before that AI needs a whole season to untangle. I was listening to a podcast since we recorded part one, and they were talking about how link, linking is dying, that people are getting their information simply by going to Google or whatever search engine, but mostly Google, and reading the AI, right? So
Well, that whole thing was supposed to be
so what
stopping
you
in the first place, right? It was meant to be Google and Facebook were going to have to give a little bit of a kickback to news companies because most people were just reading the auto-generated headline and the summary at the bottom.
Yeah, and the problem now is you don't even know where that information's coming from anymore because what's the Google one called?
Gemini? Yeah.
Gemini, yeah. It it doesn't tell you up front what its sources are. It just answers your question. And so whatever the intent of that law was, it's actually the effect has been much worse in the sense that people ask a question, they assume they're getting the right answer, but you don't even know how to track down that source, or you don't bother. Maybe that's more the truth of it. It's changing day to day. I feel like every time we do
Yeah, it's already out.
an episode, something else is going to be
Yep.
different.
Yep.
Yeah. So speaking of the AI generated content been happening is that satire will get mixed in, and then satire is being read as fact when that was never its intent. So just in case people are not aware, there are a lot of like satire news sites, but they usually say that they are. It'll be blatantly on there somewhere, and they make fun of things. And I think the like the one I always look at in Canada is Beaverton,
Mhm.
United States. So how do you think these things that kind of look like news but aren't news, journalists?
The problem is that the world is so crazy right now that some of these crazy headlines in these satire sites seem plausible.
Yeah.
And and certainly you will see people who don't know that they have come across a satire site or a satire story sharing something and saying, "Can you believe they're doing this?" or even "Bravo that they're finally cracking down on, I don't know, getting babies to stop using pacifiers after 6 months." And people will, obviously, I'm not funny enough to go on The Onion, but they're very funny when you know they're not true. And but if they can get shared really quickly, and it actually has led to a kind of cottage industry of people who, Reddit sites and Facebook pages where it's like fooled by the
No,
onion.
it's two. There's
I
a
think,
Reddit
Alexa, you were
thread called
mentioning
the R8 The Onion. And then there's another thread, and that's for people who thought the onion was real and usually then went on some kind of tirade about how ridiculous the circumstances of the article actually are. And then there's not the Onion, which is a subreddit for stories that sound like they're fiction, but they sound like they should be in the Onion, but they are actually in real news sources, and that straight up happened.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, though, there's also satire where we really know it's satire, right? The Daily Show in the States, and I'm thinking of all U.S. late night people, but and because you know the brand, you see them on, say, YouTube, and it's very clear that it's Jon Stewart, for example, and you know that he's a comedian, and they really are fake. Like the fake newspapers such as The Onion and the Beaverton, you really have to go to their websites to realize that they're satire. But I think it all goes back to what we said in episode 1, where you just have to like pause and say, what is this exactly? Like, the world is feeling increasingly absurd. So let's make sure that when it seems absurd, is this really absurd, or is it
I
absurd on
personally
purpose?
kind of almost
I think-
disagree, but I think that there's actually a ton of truth in satire, and it's worth the risk of some people thinking it's fake to actually getting across that message in a way, because it's especially like it's
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a very democratic thing, satire and parody. That is not something that would fly in any form of fascist regime. Anything like and even then going in a comment section, which is I think where people usually kind of relate these things to their own lives. Yeah, it I think gets increasingly relevant in contexts like the States right now, with freedom of speech and a lot more questionable than that Second Amendment. And then here I don't know as much. But here's an interesting thing actually to bring up just quickly. So Matt Stone and Trey Parker, 'cause I'm a diehard South Park fan. Matt Stone and Trey Parker said repeatedly they didn't put Trump in any South Park episodes until this most recent season because they said he's unparodiable. He's already a parody. We can't find a way to make fun of him, which nothing we can say he would do would be too ridiculous. And that's the crux of the issue here too. Like things are so like, it all even comes back down to the house hippo, right? Of like, you knew that was real, didn't you? I mean, I don't know anymore.
Yeah, things have gotten so chaotic in the American news environment and information environment that it's hard to tell what's going on.
And I think it's also hard to know how much of that is like permeating north, because we are not Canadians can be accused of smugness sometimes, but we're not smarter than the average American. We're just as susceptible to being fooled, and we've talked about times we've been fooled. I think what's happening south of the border is a real wake-up call in terms of the importance of staying awake to what's going, and why we're doing this podcast.
Yeah. So speaking of podcast news, as most of the time they are largely opinion based. So I just want to say our podcast, if people want to, we will have all of our sources available. There will be a list of them and links, and a link to that list in the bio.
Similar to what Chris was saying about journalists finding 3 sources, that's sort of like the principle. That's kind of a principle that I recommend to people as well when they're trying to identify if something is true or not, and that we have been trying to do for our work here is make sure we have at least 3 sources. I mean, more is always better, but
Is 3
who has
because
the
like
time?
2 is a pattern,
Just-
3 or no, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern?
Right. I don't know. Do you know, Chris?
I I think so. I never heard that said out loud, but that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
I think the idea of getting 2 feels like someone could have called
Yeah.
someone else and said, "Hey, tell them this." But I think also, like we said, Nita, more is better. But you probably have a deadline if you're a journalist, and you gotta, and also while you're doing that, you have to ensure that the sources are credible, that it's a person who would know this information. It's very easy to find 3 people on the internet who will say anything. So you just have to make sure that you, when you're checking on something to make sure it's true, check the credible sources. And we've talked about ways to do that already.
Ask one question. When we were talking about satire sites, it was sort of mentioned that usually when you go to those sites, it tells you, there's a page, an about page or something that tells you what the site is. What about fringe news sites and their pages that tell you what they are? Is anybody familiar with these sites or have any thoughts on that?
Again, this is about the credibility of the source, because a lot of people will claim to be Fox News in the States. Their slogan is fair and balanced. And whatever you feel about Fox News, they don't do a lot of reporting, right? What they do is a lot of commentary, and it all seems to be on one side of the spectrum. And so they can say they're fair and balanced, but is that really true? What I will say is there are standards out there, and the mainstream, you can go to like the Associated Press of the US, the Canadian Press of Canada. They have very, very in-depth statements on their journalistic practices, their journalistic values, that sort of thing. But people can easily copy and paste those or have it in AI for them and just put it up and then not follow those standards. So it means something when you post standards, but you really have to like critically think about whether they appear to be following those standards. What do you think, Alexa?
No, absolutely, big time. Same as the news organization, just putting that on your website doesn't necessarily mean you're actually going to go and do it. If you say that you're going to correct things and tell people, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to do it. It doesn't mean every single employee there is going to do that. It doesn't mean someone's not going to do it if they can get away with it. The rules are a nice gesture, right? And they're a nice gesture that are kind of a good indicator that someone's at least going to put a little bit of effort to try to not be inaccurate or to try to follow its own set of rules. But I mean, up until 2018, Google's like the top motto on their company code of conduct was "Don't be evil." So having the rules there is a great thing for a lot of great outlets. And in some ways, it's actually an easy thing to copy and paste onto a faith website to bolster your own legitimacy as a scam website.
Yeah.